Hey everyone, you are at the New York Ghost Story Festival, night 4. Going to run the video and then we'll go and start our program with our guests in just a second. And we're back. Hello everyone. Welcome to the festival. Welcome to night 4. When the year grows old and December's daylight departs too soon, it is time to fill the dark nights with stories of ghosts and the supernatural. This is the second annual New York Ghost Story Festival. It's our second year. Welcome. I am your host, Daniel Braum. I'm the author of the book, Underworld Dreams. I'm here with Joe Kaplan. And Eric, I forgot to ask the pronunciation of your name. I hope I have it right. Eric Guignard, is that how I get it?
All the letters and have a great sigh at the end. Guignard.
Eric Guignard. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Two people could not be here tonight. Kevin Lucia was unable to make it, so he'll be our ghost of honor. And we were hoping for the great ghost hunter himself, Mr. Charlatan Bardot, but I don't think he's going to be making an appearance. But so welcome everyone to the festival. The Ghost Story, I'll introduce the festival, then I'll introduce our guests, and we'll get to our discussion and readings. The Ghost Story Festival is an annual event of ghost story readings and discussion that was founded last year with the intent of bringing together authors of the uncanny, strange, and fantastic from New York and around the world to celebrate and examine the ghost story in all its forms. You're watching us on the YouTube channel Daniel Braum. Please subscribe if you'd like to stay in touch with the festival. This year the event is 5 nights, and we're wrapping it up tomorrow night, night 5, Saturday, December 18th. And you can come back and watch this night, and you can watch any of the nights anytime on the YouTube channel. So introducing tonight's guests. Welcome to Eric Guignard, who is a writer and anthologist of dark and speculative fiction, operating from the shadowy outskirts of Los Angeles. He's twice won the Bram Stoker Award and been a finalist for the International Thriller Writers Award and a multi-nominee of the Pushcart Prize. His latest books are his novella, Last Case at a Baggage Auction from Harper Day, the novel Doorways to the Deadeye from Journalstone, and the short story collection That Which Grows Wild from Cemetery Dance. Eric, it's good to see you. Welcome to the festival.
Thank you.
And I'd also want to welcome back to the festival this year, Joe Kaplan. Joe Kaplan is the author of It Will Just Be Us and the forthcoming Gothic Western, When the Night Bells Ring. She also writes under the name Joanna Parapinski. Her work has appeared in Fireside Quarterly, Black Static, Nightmare Magazine, Hysterian, Night Scripts, Haunted Nights, edited by Ellen Datlow and Lisa Morton, and Bram Stoker Award nominated anthology Miscreations, Gods, Monstrosities, and Other Horrors, which was edited by Doug Morano and Michael Bailey. She teaches English and creative writing at Glendale Community College, and you could also check out her reading and her discussion last year on the YouTube channel. Welcome back, Joe. How are you? How are you, Eric?
Good. It's great to be back.
Great.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to be discussing ghost stories with both of you. Since it's just the three of us, I think it's going to work out. I'll keep all of our mics on. I have questions that I'll direct to you, Eric, and questions that I'll direct to you, Joe, in turn. But we'll keep the mics on because we could just have one big panel discussion that way. Towards that, before I ask you directed questions, just a general question. Let's talk about non-USA, non-UK ghost stories, about our favorites, standouts, or leading it. How to you two do these kinds of stories differ from these USA or UK stories that some of us might be more familiar with? We'll push it over to Joe. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that the ghost story is something that just resonates through so many different cultures. I mean, I feel like throw a rock anywhere in the world and you have a ghost story. And there's just something really human, I think, about them. So what I love is really seeing the way that different cultures sort of view the ghost story. Um, you know, not necessarily like the ghost is always an evil presence, but I think there's a lot of cultures that
Mm,
where the ghost is um not maybe not a terrible presence. It's reflecting something back at us. I think it's really cool that Eric did this anthology of ghost
yeah,
stories from all around the world, and we really get that glimpse of different locations. Yeah, there it is.
trying
It
to get it
reminds me.
centered on my camera here.
There was another anthology that he did as well, The World of Horror, which again takes a look at horror all around the world. And I think that we don't, as Americans, we don't always get exposed to uh, world horror. I think that's changing, though. I think that we're seeing more and more horror stories beyond and ghost stories beyond, the sort of classic English ghost story that we're probably all
Yeah,
familiar with. Um,
I think it's moving in that direction. We're definitely going to be talking about the book and those books for sure. But I'm really glad you mentioned just in a general way of just the notion that the ghost isn't always malevolent. The ghost isn't always the bad guy. That's super interesting, and things are changing. There are a few books like Eric's, a couple of others. Um, Netflix is doing an amazing job in just bringing us, maybe intentionally or not, maybe just because the price is right or it's the pandemic times, but we're getting a lot of foreign language films, and lumped into that are the horror films, and a lot of them are ghostly. So that's bringing it to our attention. Um, but yeah, any examples of just a good story where or something that pops to mind, like where the ghost isn't the malevolent presence or isn't even meant to terrify?
yeah, I've been thinking about this. It was a novella that came out a couple years ago by Karen Warren, a
Mm,
an Australian writer, into bones like oil. I think that's what it's called. Yeah. Um, I found that such an interesting ghost story. It takes place in this like rooming house where people who are experiencing insomnia are going to get some sleep, except when they sleep there, the ghosts begin to speak through them. And it's a very melancholy story. There's tons of atmosphere. It's very creepy, but it's not the ghosts are creepy in the sense that it's this unfamiliar presence and being sort of filled with or being the vessel to speak uh speak the voice of the dead. But they're not a malevolent presence. They're just
mm,
they're just there. There's something um every day, ordinary almost about it, that it just is. There are just ghosts here. And I think it informs the story in such an interesting way that when the ghostly presence is not something horrific, it's just a part of the existence of these characters, and it asks us to really look at the way we interact with each other, the way we think about death, the way the relationships between the characters. So I think ghost stories that do that are really interesting, and I'm always looking for stories that use ghosts to do something new.
Mm.
Can I add on to that, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Karen. Yeah, of course, Karen Warren is an Australian author, and Eric, you've got quite a few Australian in the book here. But yeah, I'd love to hear.
So I wanted to build on to the Karen Warren conversation because I adore Karen Warren. I worked on an entire primer, just an introduction to the work of Karen Warren, just to spread her greatness around the globe, because that's how strongly I feel about her writing. It's beautiful, it's elegant, it's unique, it's meaningful. And as Joe said, so many of her stories revolve around ghosts. They use ghosts in a plethora of unique and different ways. Occasionally, the ghosts may be scary. Very frequently, though, they simply exist. They're part of the world around us. For example, one of my favorite stories by her, in fact, one of my favorite stories of all time that I've read is a story called Guarding the Mound. And all that is, it is a short story about a ghost whose sole existence after death is to protect the living legacy of a lineage of rulers. So in that case, he's meant to be the haunting force to keep away grave diggers, to keep away thieves, to keep away other things that would impede upon this legacy. And so him as a ghost, that's his sole duty, is just to exist and to keep an eye on those who are living. And once he fails in that duty, essentially the legacy has been wiped away. But Karen's stories, they speak to you. They're very meaningful. And again, I could read her stories. She has, I believe, 5 collections now, and each ghost story is different than the last. You can read them over and over and think, I can't believe this is just an entirely new direction that she's taking this.
I love that. Was that that story that you mentioned? Is it Guarding the Mound? That sounds so interesting. Is that story set in Australia, or is it set somewhere else?
No, it is in my recollection. It's not set in any named land. It's a fantasy, or more to the point, it's a dark fantasy, and there's no time associated with it. There's no era, except that it spans generations. It spans eons, which is really a remarkable trait to be able to incorporate successfully into a short story. So it has a very kind of a medieval feel to it, almost a barbarian feel to it in its beginning, but by its end, it is cosmic.
Yeah,
that's something I haven't contemplated. Oh, go ahead, Joe.
No, I remember reading that story and loving the way that it spans so much time. I think I love stories that play with time, and I feel like ghost stories in particular really give you the opportunity to play with time because of the way that ghosts are. They sort of almost exist outside of standard linear time. So I love that about that story.
Yeah. It's almost hopeful in its nature, because there's the atheist sense that our body dies, we're essentially gone. But by exploring through ghost stories, they're timeless. They become eternal. If there's some sort of a revenant, whether it is interacting with mankind or not, it's out there, and it's out there for all time, for all of existence.
You both raised interesting points that I hadn't thought of too much about. Joe, the notion of the ghost story, of how it's able to use time, and Eric, you said the Karen Warren story is in a secondary world. It's a fantasy. And those are two aspects or interactions of the ghost story I haven't thought of. But bringing it back to Australia for a minute, Eric, I'll read the name of the book since we can't wait to get to it. It's you've got a new anthology out. It's called Professor Charlatan Bardot's Travel Anthology to the Most Fictional Haunted Buildings in the Weird Wild World. I'll hold it up once again while you hold it up as well. We'll get
Cheers.
Okay.
Oh wait, we've got a 30-point triangle. We are not summoning ghosts. Or are we? But
I want to make this viral. Everybody's going to have a challenge to get the book and hold it up on camera to their friends and peers.
Yeah, the camera portal. We're going to be talking a lot about this book tonight. The first thing, just because it came up, I want to ask you about Karen. So Karen Warren is an Australian author. You've got quite a few. One of the great things about the book is you've got it's grouped by geographic location, by continent. So you've got quite a few Australian authors there. Over to Eric. Is there something you noticed about, in general, about the grouping of Australian ghost story authors, about the Australian ghost stories, where you could say, this is something I noticed. I know it's impossible to say, this is what the Australian ghost story is like, because I get the feeling that just from Karen's work, they're already so diverse. But looking for similarities, were there any similarities? Were there any things that you noticed as the anthologist about Australian ghost stories in general, or about the ones that you picked for the book that felt Australian to you?
Not really. And I wish I had a different answer for that, but they do kind of have a very European, American sensibility to them. Each one, it's themed to a different type of a building type. So I have, let's see, Octavia Cade. She wrote about a giant aquarium, type of like a museum, like an abandoned museum's aquarium. Karen wrote about an abandoned mine or a mining camp. Terry wrote about a haunted lighthouse. In these sense, the styles of stories, they're, in my opinion, they feel familiar. But I can answer that question more to the lines of other geographic areas. So, for example,
yeah, we'll certainly hit that up for sure. I wanted to stay on Australia for a minute. I wonder, maybe because you did say it was he said it's slightly European, and Australia, at least the Western and the white presence on the continent is relatively young, and obviously a lot of it is coming from Europe. So I'm just wondering if there's still a lot of that going on there. And the book does focus on haunted buildings. I traveled to Australia. I spent a few months there, and one of the things, maybe this is a bit of a non sequitur, or it's on the borderlands of what it is to be haunted. Some of the cities, Brisbane in particular, some of the big cities are places that are in flux. So they're places that were smaller, and they're I'm not going to say growing pains. I guess it's all in perspective. But Brisbane in particular was going from what we might think of as a smaller city to a larger or more modern city, and there were a lot of, I'm not going to say abandoned places, but there are a lot of places that were no more. One of them that struck me, I'm a rock and roll person. There was a venue there called the Cloudland Ballroom, where I guess a lot of Australian rock and roll shows had been, and I think it's now the Cloudland Condominiums or something like that. So I just was fascinated by this idea of so it's not quite haunted places, but haunted sense of place, like places are different places in time, things that are left behind.
You wrote a story about that, Dan, didn't you? I remember
I had that story. Yeah, that's it dawned on me, because I always think I always do want to mention my stories, but I'm like, well, I don't think I write ghost stories on the nose. I'm thinking, well, okay, yeah, maybe that Cloudland, that Cloudland story could connect up that way in the feeling of, it's not a ghost story, but there's a place in the story that no longer exists. So I didn't even think of it that way. But Eric, going back to you, you've written in Anthologize, so in the travel anthology to the most fictional haunted buildings. So there's more than Australia there. We've got other places, other continents, and you said other places felt like they were more more similarities, more groupings. Let's go back to that. What were some of the places that you felt did have a regional thing that you could point at, and what were those?
Sure. When you immediately brought up that remark, my first thought was, I have a section for Latin America. And the
Mm.
Latin American stories, many of them had a very politicized view to them. Basically with militarization, with colonization, with regimes coming in, people being brutally slaughtered based on their political beliefs. So there's a lot of political repression, as well as religious, very heavily religious overtones associated with that. And I could get that sense from story to story to story.
Mm.
And then when I read stories from Africa, African stories, they tend to have a very mythological feel to them. A lot of sense of family, speaking back to not just the ghosts of today, but ghosts of generations past, ghosts of basically ancestral ghosts coming in. Naturally, also tones of colonization, of political repression, slavery. But you do have this sense that they're very ethereal stories. And then many of the Asian stories, I can see them aligning with the Yukai legends, which are, ghosts and monsters of inanimate objects. Ghosts that act as cautionary tales for the way that society expects you to behave. And if you act, in a different manner, something very negative, something very dire is going to happen to you. And maybe not just to you, but to your family and your loved ones, which are really the most important element of the life.
Wow. I have a ton of follow-up questions I want to ask on that, but I'll unpack them one at a time. Let's go back to the African notions. One of the standout stories that we were talking about as we were preparing was called Bridge with No Middle by Ugandan author Derek Lubangan Carey. Did I get his name right?
It's Lubangakeen.
Derek Lubangakeen, Bridge with No Middle. That's a story set in the South Sudan. Without further ado, can I turn it over to you, Eric, and let's hear one of these ghost stories.
Oh, thank you so much. I'd be delighted to. So the following story, it's a piece of what might be considered microfiction. I call a tiny tale. It's rather brief, but no less impactful than a story 10 times its length. The title of this story is The Bridge with No Middle by Ugandan author Derek Lubangakeen. The bridge with no middle towers over a dried riverbed south of Malakal County in the Upper Nile region, north of which lies the belt of the Sahel. Pastoralists settle one side of the river, and on the other are farmer folk and long-limbed fishermen, hoarse-voiced from driving herons away from their drying racks. Both peoples speak the same language, although they have never shared words. Legend says, if you walk long enough on this bridge, you'll not emerge on the other side of the White Nile, but come upon the end of the world. Only a farmer's boy has ever returned from such an excursion, and when he did, the rain poured for 3 nights. The elders, plume-crowned and glaucoma-ridden, said the rain marked the sorrow of the gods. The gods lament the ill that mortal hands have wrought, they said. They named the boy a messenger from these gods, but they could not divine the message. Their gods, like the white man's god, favored silence. The warrior caste, impatient to divine their own message, ventured bridge-wise, only to become sacrifice to the stonework bridge, like the many who had made the journey before. That bridge, now sunken, still echoes with the screams of warriors tumbling down. Alas, you will never hear their proverbial splash. La
Oh,
fin.
wow. Thank you for that reading. While we're applauding that excellent start off to our ghost stories, we're going to say hello to some of our friends and colleagues in the comments. Say hi to Amelia and hi to Lisanne. Hi to everyone who's tuned in. That's a great story to start off with the bridge, because the name of the book is the travel anthology to the most haunted buildings in the weird, wild world. And I wanted to ask you, so it is a book of ghost stories and hauntings. Why did you decide to the conceit of approaching it through the buildings, Eric, when you were putting it together?
Sure. Well, I'll start off by saying this book was the result of pandemic. It was the result of wanderlust,
Okay.
of basically being trapped indoors during quarantine. I basically suffered cabin fever. And I started dreaming about, man, I miss going out. I miss doing things. There's so many places in the world that I haven't experienced. And it just felt like this is all, I don't want to go so far as calling it an apocalyptic time, but it's certainly life-changing. And I decided I wanted to do an anthology exploring different regions. And Joanna earlier mentioned I had previously done an anthology called A World of Horror, which it was meant to act as a showcase of authors from all over the globe, basically just writing unthemed dark fantasy or horror stories that just had some sort of atmospheric element or mythology related to their homeland. And I was so proud of that anthology, and I really wanted to do a follow-up, but I wanted to make it more than just A World of Horror Part 2. So essentially, I framed it like a travel guide. I kind of framed it like the travel guide series, like Lonesome Traveler, that I've always admired. That if you wanted to go out backpacking in any region, you get a copy of Lonesome Traveler or one of the similar ilk, and it gives you all the destination points within that land. And then building upon that are haunted ghost tours. So if you go down into any city, they've got the walking tours, and your tour guide is pointing out, here's this haunted location, and over here's this haunted livery stable or school or church, and this all has ghost stories associated with it. So I kind of wanted to build all of that together and say, I want to create my own travel guide for all of the most haunted places in the world. But I'm a fiction author. I want to make up places. So I want authors to create and invent their own legends rather than just reiterating, the same legends that are already out there, the stories that anybody could look up on Wikipedia. I have great respect and I love hearing those stories. But again, I wanted to build upon those.
Well, mission accomplished. Gonna get back to that in just one second. Joe, was your I love the idea of made up places side by side with not made up places. Joe, is your story that we're gonna get to later on in the show, is that a made up place or not?
Well, it is a made up place. So my story in that book that was like the stipulation. They are made up places. So my story in the book it's a research station in Belize, and there are research stations in Belize. I just made one up.
For sure.
And then I also infused the made up place with real life, actual mythological components from the area. So kind of that meshing of the fictional and the real.
Okay, great. Well, mission accomplished. Eric, it really does read and feel like a travel anthology, like a travel book. And hearing your inspiration for the book, it makes so much sense. Like, one of the things that I love about fiction is that it can address that wanderlust for those of us who can't travel, be it for whatever reason, or can't travel no more. Yeah, one of the things that writing always did for me, or the best writing, was when I felt like I went to a place, whether it was a secondary world like Karen Warren's secondary fantasy, or a secondary world of fantasy, or one of my favorite authors, Joe and I were just mentioning him briefly before we went on camera, Lucia Shepard, who also had written a story about Belize. An author like Shepard or an author like Karen Warren, when you're done reading that, you really have gone somewhere. Like you've felt it. And you mentioned how the ghost story can tell us so much about the people. Let's stick to Latin America. You mentioned that the Latin American stories that you came across your desk for this story, for this book, were all they had that military aspect, and they had a bit of that upheaval going through it. And right, there's so much side by side. We have we're going to hear in Joe's story about the folklore, the mythology of a place. Yet these places are living and breathing, and the people are living there. They're living there right now, and a ghost story can also tell us so much about what it's like right now. We're jumping all over the world. Have either of the two of you seen a movie called His House by any chance? Have you seen this one? Eric, not yet?
Yeah.
I've heard
Joe,
it,
yes,
but
Eric.
I haven't. I always have to give the quick explanation. Like anytime somebody asks me if I've seen a recent horror movie, I used to be up to date, but I have young children, and we don't watch horror movies in the house because they're sensitive to that. So I see Disney.
Understood.
Movies. Drives me crazy.
There's no explanation needed. I'm decades behind on everything. The only reason I know this one is some of the other guests earlier in the festival alerted me to it, and I got right on it. But it reminded me of Bridge with No Middle. We won't spoil it for Eric, but yeah, it's one to check out, and it's one that that does stand out in that it combines so many elements of an African experience that we don't normally get to see in a ghost story or in films. It has the mythological side, it has the upheaval, it has the humanist side. So yeah, His House was a wonderful film. If you're looking for something different that both delivers what you want from a ghost story, the scares, the mystery, the sense of fascination, but also it's got another layer to it, and I love stories that do that. Eric, another question for you. Going back to the Australian section, you did a great job of capturing a lot of Australian authors who are certainly on my radar. There, you've got Jack Dan in there, who I think he's in Melbourne by way of New York. You've got some Angela Slatter, who we're fortunate enough who's going to be on the show tomorrow. And you've got some Terry Dowling in the mix. Before you're going to read for us from a different Terry Dowling story, but before you do that, can you tell us about the Terry Dowling story that is in the travel is in the travel anthology, and why you chose it for the book? If you could tell us that.
Sure. So I adore Terry Dowling's writing, and I invited him to be a part of this anthology. So I chose to accept his story, obviously, because it's in print, but naturally I find I'm probably just going to accept anything that he sends to me. So what he did send to me was a story, and it's part of his series of books, and it's about dream detectives. So this is almost a mystery story of a ghostly presence that is being held back by a line of lighthouses that was developed during the occultic craze of the late 1800s of the Victorian era.
Wow.
And at one point, as people lost the belief in it, one of the lighthouses was torn down, And so it created a break in this barrier. But I'm not going to get too far into the story, but essentially those who still believed in it, they created a miniature version through a Tiffany lamp. The forces are able to come through based on the color schemes of the sky, of the lamp. And for those who are nearby, they can affect them. They essentially drove a character to suicide. They literally, it's the lighthouse represents the brink of life. And so one woman was pushed off of the brink of life, metaphorically, but it caused her literally to die. And so these individuals that work out of an asylum, they essentially go in to do research to determine what had caused her death, and what is causing these other mysterious happenings along this line of lighthouses known as the Five Sisters.
That's wonderful. I mean, it sounds so fun. It sounds so intriguing, and ghost stories have a long connection all the way back to Haunting of Hill House. There's always that connection with the researcher or the occult. So that Terry Dowling one sounds wonderfully conceived. Can you tell us but you're going to be reading from a different Terry Dowling story. Can you tell us the name of that one? Perhaps about the ghost by way of setting it up, and then we'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me pull out a volume of Stephen Jones's Best New Horror. I love these volumes. I'm sure you're both familiar with them. The peer of Ellen Datlow and Paula Guran's year's best compilations. I have a library of these. They're amazing. So this Terry Dowling story that I'd like to read from, I forget the year it came out, about 12 years ago, I believe. It's called Two Steps Along the Road. And in my opinion, it's one of the finest modern ghost stories that has been written. It is brilliant. It has an ending that just knocks you over. It's eloquent, it's beautiful, it's emotionally resonant all the way through. So essentially, there is also a detective, kind of a professor who's investigating subject matter of the paranormal. But he's not just investigating individual ghosts, he's investigating across the line of all paranormal activity that he believes are all related, and they all come from a core concept belief. So every culture, every mythology, the way that they present ghosts, the way that we discussed it at the beginning of this presentation of tonight's festival, what is the meaning of the ghost? And it goes beyond just in terms of haunting. It goes beyond just malevolence. But that the specter is there and it has a purpose. So this individual, he believes that everybody does have, all ghost hauntings have a core. So he has an opportunity to travel to Vietnam, where a hotel owner says that his daughter that is living there at present is actually a ghost. But her as the ghost refuses to acknowledge that. And she says it is really his daughter. So he's brought in there to investigate what is actually going on. And it soon becomes very apparent she is a ghost, because all kinds of strange, terrifying little supernatural activity goes on just in her presence. So I'm just going to read
I'm going to turn it over to you, and give me a cue when you've hit that last line, just so I know, and I'll switch it back. So let's turn it over to Eric.
Okay.
Reading from Terry Dowling.
All right.
Let's turning it over to me. Let's turn it over to Eric.
I'm going to read with Daniel's voice. So, as if in reprisal for secrets kept, games played, the cafard returned that night. Thomas woke around 2:00 a.m., lay listening to the night in his room, wondering about Lizzie. Would she know? Did she know? Lizzie, with her mantis green gaze, and dark designs. No rain flagged it this time, no wrong weather. All the safe signatures were there. The insects, the bird calls, the eels blindly turning, striking the walls of the water tank up on the roof, now and then in their restless sweeps. Then the certainty was there, just like before. She's outside. She's come, calling again. All part of the world, Thomas told himself. Just another part of the world. Nothing less, nothing more. But this time he would brave it, endure it, go out into the hallway, talk to this Stoyan of the Hotel D, as if to any other living thing of the world that had sense enough to understand. He left his bed, dressed quickly, and went to the door. She could just as easily have been inside the room, but no, she wants me to go to her. She wants the fear, the control, her dark designs. Thomas opened the door, but there was no one, nothing. So he stepped into the hall. He made himself do it. And there, Lizzie was at the far end, outside her room, just standing, watching, staring with her dark, too narrow eyes. Her swept up, I know something you don't, grin. He actually took 4-5 steps towards her, needing to be sure of what he was seeing. Lizzie? He asked. Her smile curved up. He shouldn't have been able to see it. Not the eyes or the grimace, not at this distance, not for a moment. There was just the one lamp giving light behind her on the stand near the top of the stairs. But he did. He could. There was light on her face. Impossible light. She was bending light to show her eyes. That dreadful, overdone smile, as if to say, here for you this time. Lizzie? He asked again, and he fought not to blink. She'd be gone if he did, and this mattered. Lizzie as Joan Petite. Joan Petite as Lizzie. And why didn't her father, Stefan, hear him calling? Were they in collusion? Let's serve up this stranger? Perspiration beaded his forehead, beaded and ran, fell, stinging his eyes, blurring his vision. He had to blink, had to. He resisted, but couldn't help it. He did it so quickly. And she had not gone. Instead, she was closer, much closer, halfway down the hall now, arms at her sides, grin slashed and curving, just standing there. Yet he had not seen her move. Lizzie? He asked again. He began retreating, step by backward step, not daring to turn or look away. He reached his room, found the door shut. Shut! He fumbled for a knob that wasn't there. He had to glance back and find it. The knob had moved. It was half a yard higher on the door. But he reached up and he turned it. He glanced back as the door swung in, and she was right there, 4 yards away, now in that dark hallway, the light on her face all wrong. But then, third reprieve! He was through, and the door had shut and locked, and he stood giggling and shaking, sobbing, triumphant he'd made it. He left his bedside lamp lit. Thank God! But when he looked, he saw Lizzie sitting on the end of his bed. She, as if to say, got you. He wished she actually would say it, voice it, say something, anything. It was too quiet. Just the jungle sounds, the night insects, the bump, bump, bump of those eels in the water tank on the roof. And then she raised her arms. Come to me. Her eyes held him. The smile, it cut, slashed, struck out, drew him forward, and the eels kept circling, turning, thumping, thumping in the dark. And it happened. Whatever it was, everything it was, the cool mouth, the thrusting tongue, the slim body against his, atop his, when the clothes were gone, arms clamping, legs locking him hard, the mouth fixed, open, thrusting, breathing into his, giving, taking, and all the while the eels kept turning, thumping, thumping. And that's where I'm gonna stop at that moment. So make sure you pick up the anthology or any other publication that includes the entire story of Two Steps Along the Road by Terry Dowling.
Thank you so much for that reading of that Terry Dowling story. I'll have one more ghost story that I'll want to ask you about. We've been talking a lot about ghost stories from around the world. There's one that you mentioned to me by an American author, Kelly Link, but it's arguable that the story that we're going to ask you about isn't we could say it's a ghost story from not around the world. It's hardly an American story. This one is from her book Get in Trouble, Two Houses. Can you tell us a little bit about Two Houses, why you picked it as a standout, and how Kelly Link approaches that particular haunted place, which is quite interesting?
All right, I have a bad habit to be rather verbose in my responses. I'll try to keep it succinct. I'm actually kind of appreciative now, as much as I would have loved to have shared space with Kevin and your other guests. It gives me more time to be able to speak on this. I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with Kelly Link. She's one of the most astonishing short story authors of the modern age. She's even been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, which is even more astounding that she's actually involved in the horror genre and to gain that sort of literary accolades. So this particular story called Two Houses, it is amazing. There is so much going on. It actually takes place in outer space. So it takes place in outer space, and it's very ethereal. It's a group of astronauts that are traveling in side-by-side spacecraft. And they go into hypersleep, and they wake up occasionally. They go to sleep. They wake up. And at this moment in time, they've woken up for one of their birthdays. So naturally, the mothership that they're in, it is able to recreate any environment for them, for their surroundings, whatever they would like to be peaceful, whatever they would like to reimagine or revisit. So while they're in this spacecraft, their sister spacecraft at some point has vanished somehow. They believe it's been destroyed while they are sleeping because there's only now their singular craft moving along, although one of the astronauts claims to have seen it appear and vanish before her eye. So while they're having the birthday celebration, they decide, of all things, to tell ghost stories. So just like you're seeing,
and this is why Kelly Link is an American treasure. Like Neil Gaiman says, we need to get 2 armed guards on her at all times. And
it just goes her layers. The story just goes, it just builds up and up. So now, wrapped within this framing of a spacecraft and a missing spacecraft, the astronauts naturally want to tell ghost stories. And so each one of them has a chance to recite a very brief ghost story, which in itself is just another micro story within the story. Their environment changes. So they talk about the ghost story of going into a beautiful glade that happens to be haunted if you're the right type of a person that has a creative imagination and can see the ghostly picnickers who are sitting there at a table and motioning you to come along. So the spacecraft creates this environment, and the astronauts, as they're listening to the ghost story, they're all transported to the glade, and they all can witness the ghosts motioning for them. So it's very surreal because suddenly they are now feeling that they're actually in this haunted location and feeling drawn to these individuals. And they have the conversation, what would happen if we go to them? What's the line between reality? What's the line between imagination? What's the line between what's actually happening or what's around us? So then the next individual tells a story of haunted stories. And then this one ties into the actual name of two houses, because for an artistic installment by an eccentric millionaire, they transported a haunted house from another nation and then had it recreated by brick in an experiment to see if this house is haunted and they move the house, will the ghost move with the house? And if they recreate the house exactly as it originally was, will they recreate the ghost? Because the house was a murder house and it's filled with bloody stains and it's filled with the spirits of those who were murdered with an axe. So if they recreate the bloody stains in the environment, will the ghost then reappear there? So of course the
Eric?
astronauts, they see it all. And it kind of
you've set up a haunted place, a haunted. Oh, you did a wonderful job of relaying what Kelly Link set up as a mystery worthy of the greatest haunted place hunter. We may have to put Mr. Charlton Bardot on such a mind-blowing Kelly Link. This is why it's probably both a curse and a blessing to be Kelly Link, to be that genius. Hey Kelly, we're doing a ghost story anthology. Can you write a ghost story? Sure. Enter the summary that Eric is not even done relaying to us. Kelly, she can't just write a ghost story. Well, actually, she can. She's last year, Jeff Ford, Brian Evanson, and I think we heard the whole thing. We talked about in great detail the specialist hat, which is just such a riff worthy of M.R. James. So Kelly can do the ghost story, and can she ever do the ghost story with two houses, like layers upon layers upon layers? Not only are we going to get a ghost story, we're going to contemplate the ghost story, and the haunted house. That's is there anything else you wanted to? I interrupted you because I had to talk about the haunted house, but if you wanted to finish up your what you wanted to relay to us about why you're loving Two Houses, I'm digging it.
Oh, sure. I apologize. I feel like I did preface that I wouldn't be too verbose. And
no. Yeah, look, we're maybe Joe's gonna have to do an intervention, because if left unchecked, I'll talk forever about Kelly Link. But we'll hear a little bit more, then we'll wrap it up. We'll go back to some Central American ghost stories.
Oh, that's okay. I won't say too much more of it. Essentially that's the story, but essentially it, as Kelly Link always does, her endings are left open to interpretation, because naturally the environment that they're in, they see their sister ship next to them, and then they have to wonder, is it really there? Is it being manifested by the ship? Are they themselves ghosts? Are they reliving the echoes of what's happened? Leave it to your own methods to decipher it. So, the end.
Well, that was a wonderful recounting without reading it. I'm a huge fan of Kelly Link. I think she's a treasure. I love talking about her ghost stories here. Wouldn't it be great to have her at the Ghost Story Festival? Stay tuned. Maybe this will be happening next year. That would be such a great thing.
It's a challenge.
So, the challenge. Kelly, Santa, not Kelly. Santa, if you hear me, please deliver a letter to Kelly Link. I think we're about in the middle point of of where we're at. So before we move on, I've got some questions that I'm going to throw over to Joe's way. I just want to um, mention Joe and Eric's work one more time. Joe's latest book is called "It Will Just Be Us." That's a novel that came out in 2020, and her next one is coming in 2022, and that's called "When the Night Bell Rings." We've mentioned a bunch of work by Eric already, but you also edit and publish the anthology series Horror Library, which promotes unthemed horror short stories. And if I'm not mistaken, Volume 7 is coming out in March of 2022. And of course, we're talking tonight about the travel anthology to the most fictional haunted buildings in the weird, wild world. Over to you, Joe. We were talking about your story. One of my superpowers is to mispronounce names, as I've been doing all night. But that's Ixtabi. Is that the name of the story?
Ixtabi, I think.
Ixtabi.
I had
Okay.
to look this up myself to try to get the pronunciation.
Ixtabi. No, thank you. I'm apologizing for. I should have done better on this, but thank you for correcting me. Ixtabi. Before we hear from it, where tell us this is a Central America. Where in Central America is this story set?
So this is set in Belize, and I feel like it's a country that it's a small country that is so often overlooked. And when I had the opportunity to write a Central or South American story for this anthology, I had been to Belize, and I just knew there was just something really special
Mm,
about that little country. It's almost a magical place. I mean, there's miles and miles of like pristine rainforest. There's
mm.
beautiful coast. It's such an interesting location that I had to write a story that was set there.
And I'm glad. I'm so glad you did. I think it was on your social media that I got cued into the book. I'm Belize. I'm glad you wrote about Belize. It's a little country. It only became Belize in, I believe it was 1986 or 87. Previously, as the professor might notice in his travel, the older editions of the anthology, it used to be British Honduras, and it only got its current iteration in '86. But like Joe, I accidentally went there, a couple of decades
Accidentally.
ago. Accidentally, yeah. I was telling Joe the story. I was
That's the
going
story.
somewhere else, and I was en route, and that's a story for another time. But accidentally is the proper word. But what a happy accident, because like Joe was relating, it is a sort of place that as soon as I got there, and I was just a fledgling writer, I knew that this was a place that really was sparking my imagination and made me want to write. So hey, before we hear more about that, Joe, will you read? We get a chance to hear the story from you, so I'll turn it over to Joe.
All right. Macaw Research Station sits in the heart of the Belize jungle, an hour's drive from the nearest airstrip. On the day the visiting professor arrived, a young scientist of sustainable ecosystems drove out to pick him up. Rain beat down when she ushered him into the car, jacket pulled over the professor's bald head. They tore off beneath the green canopy where the downpour quieted and the road became dirt. He introduced himself with hesitant politeness, and she introduced herself with easy good humor. The visiting professor's name was Ellison. The driver's name was Jana. He asked how long she had been a driver for the station. "Today's my first day driving," she said, "but I do have my PhD." Ellison raised a surprised, perhaps disbelieving eyebrow, which deepened the grooves of age in his face. His granite eyes found the midnight dark hand clutching the stick shift and darted back to her round, smiling face and corkscrew hair. "Of course, everyone here has their PhD," she continued. The car bumped violently over deep welts in the dirt road while she swerved around the worse ones. Brown puddles splashed each time a tire sank into the depressions. "PhD. Pothole driving." She laughed over the gunshot rattling of rough terrain. Ellison grabbed the handle above the door. "Shouldn't you slow down?" "Then we'll never get there. Anyway, don't worry, there are no speed limits in Belize." This only seemed to make the professor even more worried. He gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "I've faced bushmasters in Costa Rica, white caimans in Trinidad and Tobago, and hordes of scorpions in Huatulco. I suppose a few potholes won't kill me." Even so, he was green by the time they arrived at the research station campus. Jana slowed so she could point out the different buildings. The kitchen, the thatch roofed open structure with hammocks for relaxing, the bunkhouse, laboratory, library, composting toilet, and the new observation post for rangers. As they went the long way around to the cabins, Ellison glimpsed a vine tangled building through the twisted branches of a ceiba tree. What's that? The old observation post. It's no longer in use. How come? She told him that the building was falling down. See how all these buildings are elevated? The floor of the old observation post began to rot in the damp. Might collapse if you try to walk on it. Will they make some other use of it? He asked, frowning as it shrank out of sight behind him. Leaving it there to rot seems a bit pointless. No one likes to go in there, she said as they pulled up to the cabins. Here we are. Why don't you go put away your things and I'll take you to the dining hall? When he was ready, they headed to dinner, swatting mosquitoes. His smile was thin but congenial. I look forward to meeting the other scientists. I expected to be greeted by one, actually, but you've been very helpful for a driver. Ignoring his dismissiveness, Jana opened the door to the dining hall. Dr. Diali, a short, dark woman with an infectious smile, waved them over to introduce Ellison to the station's director. They served themselves rice, beans, and hudut, a traditional Garifuna dish of fish with coconut milk and mashed plantains, followed by chocolate. When Jana handed Ellison a can of Bellican beer, he took it ruefully, having discovered his earlier mistake. So you do have a PhD. An academic one, I mean. Of course, she said. I told you today was my first day as a driver. You drive like a pro, said Ellison. Never would have known you were just a simple scientist. She found herself charmed by the awkward, pinched way he smiled, the mark of a man who spent more time in nature than with people, and whose social skills reflected it. Here was a man pushing middle age who had dedicated his life to traveling the globe in the name of science, a life of adventure that also courted loneliness. Jana was no stranger to loneliness. Life at the research station was not conducive to exploring relationships. Except for several aborted flirtations among the staff, Jana had been single for almost 2 years. She grabbed 2 more beers and strolled into the humid night with Ellison, the darkness spraying stars overhead like speckles of white paint. He told her he was recently divorced. His wife had no longer been able to sustain his frequent absences without resorting to infidelity. Not that he had been entirely loyal on some of his longer trips. A sense of lonesomeness just always seemed to find him. They wandered to the edge of the light, spreading out from the dining hall behind them, to the line where it met the black wilderness. He leaned in first, or she did, it was hard to say. They kissed. When they pulled back, his eyes widened over her shoulder. Who's that? Jana turned, but only caught the shape as it slunk away into the darkness. Let's go back to the dining hall, she suggested, but he held her by the shoulders. A ripe smell like carrion flowers wafted over them, thick and putrid and sweet enough to choke. It's dangerous out here, she tried again. There are jaguars all over this forest. It's really not safe to be out after dark. That was no jaguar, that was a person, Ellison said, eyes still searching the distance. As his attention slipped away, Jana tried to suppress the opening wound that threatened to bruise her heart. It's no one. It was a woman. He took a step away from Jana, trying to catch sight of the person. Beautiful, with long black hair, a white dress. It looked sheer, and her feet were bare. She's not someone from camp, I can tell. But you know, don't you? She's a ghost, said Jana, her voice hardening. The kiss was already forgotten, grown cold on her lips. Forget you ever saw her. A ghost? Ellison laughed. Is that supposed to be a joke? No joke. Right, so what does this ghost want? To seduce you. He laughed. Are you jealous? Jana shoved him hard enough that he stumbled. Fuck you. You want her? Go and find her. But you won't like what you find, for true. She marched back to the dining hall. Left alone, Ellison felt the gleam of mystery at hand. Ghost or not, he knew there was more in the jungle still beyond the reach of science, species utterly unknown to man. It was what drew him to these wild places. The woman in the trees was yet another mystery he felt compelled to solve, and he definitely did not wish to return to the dining hall now, where a love-scorned associate waited. He set out to pursue the mysterious woman into the trees, feet squelching in muck the afternoon rain had churned up. He could not imagine what a beautiful young woman was doing out in the jungle alone, least of all to have elicited such a reaction from Jana. He couldn't help but smile. The woman's solitude also excited him. He had always enjoyed the hunt. He followed the campus floodlights from one dark patch to the next. The night chirped and buzzed, thick with crickets and the calls of parakeets. Spider monkeys slept in the trees, and fruit bats foraged for nectar, flapping like airborne shadows. He was far from alone. When he spotted her again, it was beside the creek, in a field of mangroves. Where her feet should have sunk into the flooded ground, she seemed instead to float above it. Her eyes were like gleaming obsidian where they found him, and she beckoned him to follow with an alluring curl of her finger. Perhaps a ghost indeed, as Jana had said, or a trick, but he was never one to quit at the first sign of a challenge. The accolades Ellison had won were not done by floundering at the lip of uncharted chasms. One must leap such obstacles with a running sprint. So patiently he did follow her, as he would a particularly rare bird spotted in the canopy. Once he had pursued a quetzal for 6 miles through a dense, humid forest in Mexico, simply to claim it as his own, to learn its tricks and watch without being watched, and snap his photos. There was a deliciousness in chasing. Ellison tramped through dirty water into the dark. The smell of rot met him on the breeze, a smell like death. He sneered. He followed her to the abandoned observation post, where she climbed the ladder, giving him a tantalizing view, and he disappeared inside. She disappeared inside. Despite the strangeness of the entire situation, he felt compelled to continue after her. Testing the soft ladder, he climbed up into the warm, dark interior. Floodlights shined eerily in the distance, while moonlight filtered through the canopy and into the structure's barren windows. Perhaps the floor was rotted, but he could hardly tell. Bougainvillea climbed up the walls, flowered pink. Vines and creeping plants burst up through the soft patches of floor, overtaking it. Moss furred the ceiling. Mushrooms sprouted in damp corners. The woman set down a comb of cactus spines she had been using to brush her long black hair and smiled at him. It was a smile that he recognized, one filled with promises. It was not just finding the bird in its natural habitat, but capturing it in a cage to preserve as a trophy. He drew closer, but the smell overwhelmed him, and he began to wonder gravely at the sense of something rotten lying just underneath the heady vegetal odor that suffused the overgrown outpost. Time seemed to slow, and Ellison suddenly couldn't bear the silence any longer. If only he could hear her voice, he'd know any thought of supernatural menace would be laughed away. What are you doing out here? I heard it's not safe. To underscore his point, the floor gave a threatening groan where he stepped. He looked at her feet to see if the floor beneath her was solid and found not two human feet, but one the taloned claw of a bird and the other a cloven hoof like a pig's foot. Neither one touched the floor. Ellison froze. It was only in this moment that he considered he had made a mistake. Yet each time before he had wandered off on his own into the wilderness in search of finds that no one else was privy to, he managed to come out unscathed. It was a measure of grace and good luck that seemed to follow him. As deadly as it could be, nature had always looked out for him in his pursuit to track it down and catalog it. The woman who approached him, however, was like nothing of nature he had ever seen before. In spite of his dread at her inhumanity, he could not deny her beauty as she leaned in to press her lips to his. The foul odor overwhelmed him. Her lips were cold and slicked as with algae. The tongue that prodded him seemed barbed with tiny spikes. Riddled with horror, he tried to pull away, but vines enwrapped his ankles and held him in place. As the ghostly woman urged him on, kissed him, stroked him, took from him, he wondered with cold fear if any of his own conquests had ever felt like this. Rooted to the spot, unable to escape or say no, as he brought them to his hotel room to assuage his loneliness. Tender young things impressed by his credentials or stories of his adventures. beautiful women he had pursued down darkened hallways, thinking of them all as quests to catalog, to conquer. When she was done, the woman vanished, but the plants continued to hold him where he stood, hopeless and violated, until the floor, the rotten floor, finally collapsed beneath his feet. The next morning, the visiting professor was found, cold, wet, and half dead, not far from the creek. He had dragged himself, both legs broken and weeping blood, from where he had fallen at the old observation post until he could go no farther. Mosquitoes and fire ants had ravaged his arms and face with blistering pustules. Someone else drove him to the closest hospital, though Jana imagined how every bump on the potholed road would jostle his injured body. Before beginning her work for the day, she trekked out to the old observation post and looked up through the ragged hole where Ellison had fallen. Ixtabai, she said, and though she could not see her in daylight, she felt her presence, the beautiful Mayan woman who haunted the forest that belonged to her. You shouldn't have done that. The breeze blew her hair like a caress. Try as she might to feel something, anything, with the other flesh and blood people around her, Jana could not help but look forward to embracing her jealous lover again when the sun went down and the nocturnal forest, with all its mysteries, came alive.
Thank you so much for that reading. Each to buy. Fantastic. Did you hear that folklore when you were in Belize, or is it the product of some research, or a little bit of both?
I don't think I heard it when I was in Belize, although I did hear they talked the Belizeans that I met, the tour guides who took us around sort of into the jungle and into the cave system. They did tell us about um, some of the Garifuna culture and some of the definitely the Mayan roots of the area. I don't know that I actually heard that particular legend there, so there was definitely research involved to identify that. But I was really inspired by the the strong Mayan history in that area.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned both the Mayan and the Belizean and the Garifuna culture, because for such a small place, it is. I guess we say that about America sometimes, or we used to back in the good old days. But it is such a melting pot of different cultures. It has the Caribbean influence of the Garifuna people. It has the indigenous people, the Mayan people, and then there's the Belizeans. There's also a British influence, even Mennonite, and so in a very small area, there's a lot of different cultures, a lot of different mythology. Yeah, so it's a writer's dream, and it's just a wonderful place. So it's no secret that I'm a big fan of your work. I'm a big fan of your story. So when I heard that you had written a story set in Belize, doubly excited. Thank you so much for reading that one. You've written other ghost stories. One that I wanted to bring up was one that appeared pretty recently in the magazine, the British magazine Black Static. These birdhouses are empty now. Can you tell us? Oh, it's great. You're doing a great job in holding it up. Let's hold it up. They do such. Black Static is such a beautiful magazine as well. I appreciate that about it. Which one? Which number is that one, Joe?
So this is one of the double issues that they started
Okay.
doing, 78, 79. This
Okay.
came out
Can
last year, summer, I want to say. March. No, this year. Wait. Sorry.
you?
Like, when did this come
Time
out?
time
Well,
is
apparently
always
it came out
fluid,
this
but
year.
with the
I
pandemic
don't
time,
know.
it's one. It came out. It's here. It's real. um, I'd be hard pressed with time myself. By means of setup, can you tell us about the ghost and the ghostly approach that you used in this story before you read a bit from it for us?
Yeah. So this story was the setup is basically this woman and this woman's mother had her. Okay, sorry. This woman's
Mhm.
grandmother had owned this house before she died, and the house passed into her mother's hands, but her mother never did anything with it. It kind of fell into disrepair. And then her mother passed away, and the house passed down to her. So the protagonist of the story, Caroline, she and her father are basically going to this house to see if they can fix it up, renovate it, and maybe sell it since it's just been sort of sitting there. But something about the house or something within the house does not want to be fixed.
All right.
And
Let's turn it over to you to read an excerpt from These Birdhouses Are Empty.
sure, let me find the page. I'm just going to read a really short snippet.
Sure.
Okay. Over the many years since she lived there, my mother's childhood home had fallen into disrepair. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth, and water rot warped and bruised the floor. Cracks in the wood paneling Cracks in the wood paneling wept mold like infected wounds, and plaster peeled from the dingy walls above cabinets with missing doors that yawned blackly. It wasn't just the house, either. What had once been a lively urban neighborhood had deteriorated into a ghost town. Before she died, my mother had lamented never having done anything with the old place. It was willed to her on the death of her own mother, and for years she didn't set foot inside. She tried putting it on the market, but eventually gave up and left it to rot with the rest of her memories. Just before she got sick, she went back to see if it was salvageable. She said it wasn't. Then, when my mother died, the house came into the possession of me and my father, more unsellable than ever, given the current state of things. So, we decided to fix it up. When I was a child, my father taught me to build birdhouses. It was his hobby, where I would find him on balmy summer evenings, out in the garage meticulously lining up nails, or bent over his work table while he painted, tongue poking out the side of his mouth, and his glasses slid down to the very tip of his nose, his entire face coming to a point of concentration. Martin LeBeau had never worked in construction, but when he put his mind to a project, there would be plans drawn up, jobs delegated, T's crossed, and I's dotted. Hand me that tape measure, Caroline, he said from the top of his metal ladder when we went to assess the damage. Well, while he pulled out reams of yellow tape, he explained, first things first, we need to get these windows installed so as to stop the rain getting inside, which it looks like it already has if that rotted wood is anything to go by. Then we'll do any foundation repairs needed and the smaller stuff from there. You think we're up to this? I asked. We most certainly are, he said as he climbed down the ladder. Give yourself a little credit. Didn't you win some kind of award in high school shop class? Sure, best coffee table. You and Mom kept that thing for years. Sturdy as a house, he said with a wink. We didn't talk about what we were going to do with the house once we finished the renovation, just as we didn't talk about my mother. But we had all the time in the world to work, and then all the time after that to decide what to do with the old place. It felt like the start of something new, reclaiming a place that still carried the ghost of my mother's childhood and whatever secrets she kept from that time in her life. We held off on the second floor. The stairs looked questionable, like the wood might rot out from under my feet. Anyway, there was enough work to do on the main floor, which looked like photos of every fixer I'd seen on the house hunting websites I sometimes fancifully browsed from the comfort of my one-bedroom apartment. The kitchen was a corrosion of rusted appliances, the dining room chandelier had long ago crashed into the table, and the living room couches wore planks of wood that had splintered off from the ceiling. Behind the dining room, I found a door that was so stuck I had to throw my shoulder into it, bones singing. I heard wood grinding against wood, and the door finally gave way with a shriek, toppling me to the floor in a plume of dust. Coughing, I dragged myself, watery eyed, to my feet, only to find it was just a storage closet, with an ancient vacuum, ironing board, and cardboard boxes of stale smelling books, candles, and porcelain figurines. My shutting the door must have jarred the ironing board, which gave a muffled thump. I made a mental note not to open the door again unless I was prepared to catch the board before it fell on my head. We had our work cut out for us, I thought. On the first day of real work, we got to the house before dawn, clutching styrofoam cups of tongue-searing coffee and gazing with horrified wonder at the derelict facade. In the misty pre-dawn, the house was like the vacant gaze of a coma patient. We set to work on the windows, removing the trim and casing. Then I held up the panes of glass while my father frowningly set them in their frames. I don't like the way this sits, he said. There are gaps. I don't see any. Well, open your eyes and look. He stormed away and exhaled like a deflating balloon. Your mother used to complain about drafts, he confessed. We had gaps, bad insulation. She always wanted to get it fixed, but we never did. He looked like he wanted to say more, but nothing else came out. Let's try again. We rechecked the measurements, then fitted the glass back in. He nodded in reluctant approval and adjusted his glasses. You were right, he barked a soft laugh. My little Linny knows what she's doing. My mother used to call me Linny. I'm not so little anymore, Dad. You'll always be little to me. He inspected the window, unconsciously spinning his wedding ring on his finger. How much work you think we'll need to do on the foundation? I asked, already skeptical of our preparedness after one little window snafu. I mean, should we be hiring some guys to pour concrete? Is there a basement holding this place up? No basement as far as I know, he said. Let's see what we can see first. I don't want to hire anyone unless we absolutely have to. No sense wasting money. My dad was like that. He grew up poor, and even though he'd lived comfortably for many years, he still hated to waste a nickel. We worked into the evening as the setting sun glared through shining new window panes, lighting dust motes in the air with harsh golden light, and the dust seemed to dance and coalesce in a flurry as I passed my hand through it, then continued on its own in a whirlwind until it formed a shape like a person made of dust and light, and there was something almost familiar about the shape. I reached forward to touch it, but my hand passed through the hazy sunbeam and scattered the dust, collapsed the shape, until there was nothing there, or nothing had ever been there. I'll just leave it there.
All right,
Suffice
thank
to
you so
say, when
much.
they come back to the house, everything is broken again, and they're not sure why.
Thank you for that haunted house story. I was going to say yesterday, but night 3, we had a great conversation. We seem to be focusing in on the haunted houses. Tomorrow night, we've got Sarah Langan, who's written one of my favorite haunted house stories. But tell me, what is it? What's the appeal to you as both a reader or as a writer of the haunted house trope, or the haunted house as a vehicle for the ghost story, Joe?
I feel like I'm going to be a broken record because I think I always answer this question the same way. But
You're consistent. You're consistent. I know the feeling.
I think it's because for me, the house that's supposed to be the place of comfort, safety, family, home. I mean, that's your safe space. That's where you come back to at the end of the day, where you get to feel comfortable. And so when we have the haunted house, there's this really uncanny sense of invasion of uh, something has interrupted the safe space. There's something here that's dangerous now, that's unsettling, that's uncomfortable. And it's basically, it takes all of those things that the home should be and twists them on their head so that the familiar becomes unfamiliar. Just that sort of classic uncanny feeling. And I feel like that unsettling sense that you get from the uncanny is what draws me to horror. Not so much the in-your-face blood and guts, but that's why I love ghost stories, is they really deal with the sense of dread and uncanny, the sense that something is wrong, and we don't really understand why it's wrong.
I love that answer. I love that answer. You spoke to a lot of things that I that resonate with me in there. First of all, just the notion of it, the haunted house as horror, and horror as a sense of violation of the different safety points, and how I'm not sure where I heard it. Maybe it was a program or someone's analysis of all the different kinds of horror and what they were violations of, like body horror, being the violation, of the physical form. You added to that being the haunted house, the violation of the feeling of safety. some of the horror that I'm less familiar and less interested in, but still a student of. Like I heard an analysis of the film, why it was such an impact, maybe a little intellectual for it, but of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, something I stayed away from for a long time. But once I looked at it through that light of that movie was so groundbreaking because it was a violation of all the beats of all the places of safety. Like, oh yeah, you could make fun of it and like, oh, coming through the door, coming through this, but yeah, it's like even the violation of the places in a movie, or violation of the door of the places where we think we're going to be safe in within the trope. So I love that. I love that analysis. And then you also hit on the familiar as unfamiliar. So that's when things start to get weird, both in the literal sense of the word and in the sense of the genre. It's a space where my interest is as well. Yeah, I love it when the familiar is unfamiliar. I love it. I love ghost stories. I love the horror that is operating in those places, whether it's like with how Eric was describing Kelly Link's Two Houses, where that's on the border of metaphysics or science fiction, or the border of psychological and supernatural, or the border of real and unreal. So yeah, great analysis there. I'm going to put Eric's mic back on. We still have a little bit of time, but hey, before we wrap it up, if maybe we can play, we can move it back to Ghost Stories of the World, maybe with a little potluck section. In the travel guide, we've got the Tiny Tales. Joe, maybe over to you first. Is there just a complete random author's and guest choice? Is there another Tiny Tale that you just want to call out? I'll call one out as well, or if you want to call out one of your favorites or one of the more interesting Tiny Tales that you could share with us.
Oh boy.
Yeah, if you're on the spot, I could toss it over to Eric, or I could call one out.
Let me look through if you guys have one first.
All right, sure. Eric,
I'll catch that toss, Daniel.
All right, over to here we go. Can we do like one of those videos where they throw it on the camera?
There it is.
That was pretty good. Good catch. Well, Joe will look up for one that's and we'll turn it over to Eric, who has got one in mind for us.
All right, all I got to do now is just find the page.
Of course, now I found the one I was looking for.
I'm gonna read. This one really appealed to me. It's coming out of England by English author Laura Morrow. This is one of the earliest stories that I acquired from my anthology, and it always just kind of tends that the earlier stories that I get in for any of my anthologies, that helps to mold how the book is developed, because you want to be flexible and you want to find stories that kind of align and match together. So she happened to be one of these foundational stories. And the story is called English Martyrs Underground Station. And I am just going to give a quick little display on it if I can get it into my camera. Every one of these stories does come with its own illustration and also a detailed map with latitude, longitude coordinates where this haunted location could be found if you're so inspired to try to travel to it. So English Martyrs Underground Station by Laura Morrow. This station is gone now. It was swallowed by fire in the summer of 1993. You watched from the train window as flames lapped at dust-streaked tiles, at leather shoes, and you can still taste the smoke in the back of your throat. It was flooded in 1979, tunnel mouth drowned in black water, depthless and cold. It was bombed during the Blitz, and the screams of terrified refugees still echo in those long and empty halls, those rubble-choked platforms. It died quietly, alone, unused, and only time bears witness to its slow decay. It was never there to begin with. The station is gone now.
Oh, that's great. Great. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned, as Eric mentioned, the book is wonderfully illustrated, and it's got a mix of these feature stories, like one that Joe read, and these bite-sized tiny tales, which, hey, my attention span isn't what it used to be. It's great that you can pick it up and read one like that, and then, or you can just dive deeper into the book. So it's a lot of fun. We'll throw it over to you, Joe. You've got one called
Yeah,
up for
I
us.
found one. Yeah, honestly, I love all these tiny tales so much, so I
Yeah.
just picked one that I think is really fun. This is Ingram's Bookstore by Alan Baxter, kind of throwing it back over to Australia. Leaving behind the salt smell of the harbor and the sounds of cockatoos playing on the post office clock tower, you enter Ingram's Bookstore with a sense of anticipation. The building excites imagination with its faux Gothic facade and amber lighting. Inside, among the perfume of old paper and ink, you walk the narrow spaces to peruse shelves bowed under the weight of many worlds. Leather bound hardcovers, well thumbed paperbacks, every kind of guide. Sometimes, while you explore, the original owner, Mr. Sylvester Ingram, may loiter just behind your shoulder, whispering recommendations or critiques. He has an opinion on every author, it seems. He has read every book. Should you turn to see him, there will be no one there. But you may catch the scent of rotting seaweed and the coppery tang of blood from the inexplicable yet fatal wounds with which he was found behind his sales desk that fateful winter morning so long ago.
Fantastic.
Lovely.
Thank you so much. We're getting ready to wrap it up here. So we just got to, in the last minutes, I just want to say thank you to our guests, Joe and Eric, for being here. Thank you to our friends and colleagues who are here cheering us along in the comments. If you can join us tomorrow, the festival wraps up. The start time is 7 p.m. tomorrow night, December 18th at 7 p.m. For night 5, the final night of this year's festival. We'll have with us Kevin Brockmeyer. He's the author I started off the festival with by reading a little bit from his Ghost Variations. So Kevin Brockmeyer, the author of the Ghost Variations, will be with us. And we'll have Angela Slatter, an Australian author who I believe does appear in the travel anthology To the Most Fictional Haunted Buildings in the Weird Wide World. The great Angela Slatter. And of course, one of my favorite authors as well, Sarah Langan, will be here tomorrow. If Eric and Joe can stick around, we're going to run the video and close out the night. But I'll do that before we do that, we'll end on a note, which is the beginning of the anthology here. I'll read the quote: "The weird, wild, and ghostly world we live in," which is how Eric begins the book with his preface, and it's how we're going to wrap up the night tonight. So stick around. We're going to run the closing credits. Stay safe, stay strange. Hope to see you tomorrow.